who's joined us so far. I'm just going to give a minute for others to join. Welcome to our second webinar of the year. As many of you know, I'm sure we run these monthly on the last Thursday of every month. And this month, in line with Human Rights Day, on Monday, our topic is business and human rights. So before we kick off, and while people sign up, I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, there's two ways to engage on the webinar. We do have the chat functionality open, and you can use that to engage with other delegates and to comment on any of the content. And then we also have the Q&A functionality, the Q&A box. I would encourage you to please put your questions into that box, as we do have dedicated time set aside to take your questions and to address them to the panelists later in the session. There's a short survey after the session. It will show up on your Zoom page. If you could please fill that out. We will also send you a link early next week. We really appreciate feedback to help us decide on future topics and to hopefully improve these webinars for you. And then lastly, I know we get asked this a lot in these sessions. The session is being recorded, and we will make the recording and the slides and the notes, so there'll be a write-up of the session available to everyone who registered. They'll also be put up on the Trialogue Knowledge Hub. Okay, so I'm Kathy, and I'll be your host from Trialogue this morning. And after my brief introduction, I'm going to hand over to our three brilliant panelists that we've got this morning to give you an overview on the topic of business and human rights and how that pertains to South African companies, and then to take you through two company case studies from two very different sectors. So I'm looking forward to hearing those. First, I'm just going to launch the first poll to get a sense of who is on the call. I do see some new names. So if you can just take a minute to select the option, the organization that you represent. While you're doing that, I just want to highlight that there are some hashtags on this page, business and human rights. And if you'd like to tweet or to post on other social media platforms, we'd really appreciate that to continue the conversation. Let me just see. Not everyone's voted yet, so if you've just joined, if you can quickly tell us where you're from. And then you'll see that there is about half an hour allocated to Q&A. So as I mentioned, please do use the Q&A box throughout the session for that. Okay, I'm going to end that poll now. And see there is a spread, but the two biggest categories we have are the non-profit organizations and the big business. So that's great. That's our usual types of audiences, and I'm hoping that these company case studies can be really useful in this space. Okay, let me stop sharing that. Okay, so as I mentioned, hello to those whose names I recognize. There are a few. But I do see some new names. So for the first timers, I just want to take a moment to introduce you to Trialogue. Trialogue is one of the few consultancy organizations in South Africa that focuses exclusively on responsible business. And we do this through consulting services as well as through our knowledge sharing platforms. On the consultancy side, we do corporate social investment consulting, strategy, monitoring and evaluation. And we also do ESG consulting and what we call integrated thinking. So looking more holistically across the company at ESG issues. On the knowledge sharing platforms, we've obviously got these monthly webinars. We then have our annual Business and Society Conference. And just to let everyone know that this is happening on the 10th and 11th of May this year. Registration is open, so I'd encourage you to go to our website if you're interested in registering for that. We also have the annual Trialogue Business and Society Handbook, which was published, the 2021 version was published in December last year. And that's available on our website for free download. And then we have the Trialogue Knowledge Hub, which is an online portal of information on different development sectors. And I'd encourage you to visit that. And as I mentioned, the recording of this webinar and the write-up will be put onto the Knowledge Hub. Okay, moving on then, just very short intro from me. We did include an article on the topic of business and human rights in the 2021 Handbook, which does give an overview of the topic, as well as some guidance on how companies can think about implementing better human rights practices in their organizations. So I'll actually pop the links for the handbook and for this article directly into the chat as soon as I've handed over. But just to say that the article highlights that the private sector actually has a very poor track record when it comes to human rights. So it outlines some of the findings of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which assesses over 200 of the largest companies globally. And it finds that most of them have this poor track record. And where there is commitments and processes in place, so some of the companies do have those in policies and commitments, but they find that there's a disconnect between these commitments and the actual performance and results on the other side. And almost half of the companies that they assessed had at least one allegation of serious human rights impacts. So I think it's still an area that needs significant corporate attention, and I'm hoping this webinar can support and help that. So after laying out what some of the issues are, the article goes on to outline United Nations development programs, 6 best practices for embedding human rights. And I think our panelists will talk a little bit more to these and how they embed them. But just briefly, these are about understanding the risks and impacts across the company as well as its value chain and supply chain. Secondly, about educating employees. So not only having the policies maybe in place, but also having education and training programs in place. The third one's about articulating the commitments. The fourth one, and I think probably the most difficult, about embedding in the business. And again, I'm hoping that our panelists can share some learnings on how they've done that. The fifth one's about being transparent, and the sixth one's about providing remedy where there have been human rights issues or human rights infringements. So it also lists, this article lists some of the resources and that are available to companies to go into a lot more detail about how to embed and how to ensure that human rights practices are incorporated into their business. And we are lucky enough to have one of our panelists who has from the National Business Initiative, which has provided a toolkit on this. But just before we move on to our panelists, I want to launch the second poll to just get a sense, human rights, as I mentioned, very broad, to get a sense of what people think, which issue people think companies should receive the most attention from companies. So I know it's difficult to choose one out of these, but we're just asking which human rights issue should receive the most attention from companies in your opinion. And like I say, I think this depends on sector. It depends on type of company. So there's not a clear answer, but we just want to get a sense of what our delegates think. So I'll just give you a minute for that. I see about half of our delegates have voted now. Give a few more seconds and then I'll share the results. Okay, I'm going to end that and share the results. And you'll see that 47% of delegates have voted for labor practices. So looking internally, looking at working conditions, pay, discrimination, inclusion. And I'm sure our panelists will speak more to that. Interestingly, I see that none of our delegates have picked the digital rights or data and privacy issues. And I'm looking forward to hearing from MTN a little bit later, because that's obviously a big area of human rights consideration for their business. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to our panelists. And our first panelist, Gugu, I'll just ask you to please turn on your camera and your mic. But our first panelist is Gugu McLaren Ushawa-Kunze from the National Business Initiative. She heads the Social Transformation Division at the NBI. And as I mentioned, the NBI have, together with the UN Global Network Compact, put together a toolkit on business and human rights. So Gugu is going to provide us with an overview of kind of what's expected of South African companies, how South African companies are faring, and their toolkit and what resources are available to companies. Thank you, Gugu.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good morning to all of the delegates and my fellow panelists. It's really good to be here today and to be speaking about this critical topic. And I think, Kathy, you've outlined very clearly where things are at in terms of business and human rights. And I wanted to share a bit of reflection around that and also go into, as you've outlined, some of the things that business can think about when addressing human rights. So as Kathy has said, I'm Gugu from the National Business Initiative. The NBI is a voluntary membership organization. We have close to 100 member companies who have voluntarily signed up to be part of the NBI and to do the deep work and deep thinking about how we tackle our most pressing social and environmental issues. And so in many ways, we are fortunate that we engage on the side of the corporate that is very much doing the work and committed. And so it gives us another side and perspective to business. And I think reflecting on kind of the 15 years that I've been in this space, to see that this issue has certainly evolved and continues to be grappled with in different ways. But to your point, Kathy, I do think that there is a lot that still needs to happen. And I think that's a reflection of the depth of the challenges that we have, the levels of inequality, the levels of exclusion that we have within our society, within South Africa, but also globally. And so human rights is essential in underpinning our responses to that. And of course, there are a number of guiding principles and guidelines that help companies think about how to do that. I mean, I'm sure most people on the call will be familiar with the International Bill for Human Rights. There's also the ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights to Work. There's the UN Guiding Principles, as well as the UN Global Compact, and a whole bank of resources that help companies think about this. The poll we just did outlined just the breadth of human rights issues. And I would say that list is even more extensive than what was on the poll. And so when you think about it from a business perspective, there is a lot that you have to think about, and there's a lot that you have to consider. And in many ways, these human rights issues are addressed in different ways and supported very much by legislation and regulations, but a lot of them are also voluntary. So it speaks to the level of commitment that companies have to this process and to this work. And so when we think about just how broad and how complex, I think is the important part, human rights is, it requires quite a careful, thoughtful process in understanding what it means for a business, knowing that a company's size, a sector, industry will impact what is most important. What you don't want to do is to be overwhelmed. And I think that there is a lot that companies have to think about in terms of their responsibility within society and their way that they operate. And so it's important that it is a thoughtful process to understand what's most critical to a company. And a useful way of framing that and understanding that is to think about sphere of influence. And I'll talk about that in a second. But what I do want to kind of highlight is the UN Guiding Principles talk about 3 critical things that businesses need to do, companies need to do. The first is to make a public commitment. And from an MBI perspective, we firmly believe that it is important that companies state what they are about, what's important to them, what is their position on things, and make a public commitment. And so that is a starting point to say it's clearly articulated that this is what a company believes and stands for. The second thing that the guiding principles talk about is understanding and addressing impact. And it's important to say, and to Kathy's point earlier, it goes beyond identifying what the impact is. It's really around how do you prevent it? And I think that preventative thing is very important. How do you mitigate and how do you account for it? And so it's really quite an extensive, deep process that needs to happen to do that in a fundamental way. And then the third aspect is about providing remedies. And so if something does happen and there is a violation or an abuse, what happens and what is the process for dealing with it? So I think that's a useful framing for how you think about what companies can do at a high level. But to think about how you can dissect something that is so complex, a useful way of looking at it, as I said, is a sphere of influence. And if you think about business and why there is this very focused look at business and human rights is because of the power and influence that business has. And when looking at the sphere of influence, obviously your starting point is the workplace. And so the poll showed that workplace issues are central and critical. It's also the place that companies can do the most, because it's a direct area that they can address issues of discrimination, they can address issues of health and safety, they can address issues of pay, and all of these issues that play into the workplace. It's also important to say that these issues are changing and evolving constantly. And so when we think of health and safety, 10 years ago, it looked very different to what health and safety looks like now. There is a much stronger focus on issues of wellness and well-being of employees. And there is also, if you look at safety, the growing focus and urgent focus on issues of gender-based violence. And I say this from a perspective of engaging with our member companies and the work that and the kind of need that has arisen for how companies deal with such a complex issue. And so when looking at these, it's to say, let's get a firm understanding of what these issues are within our workplace, but also let's continue to engage on it and understand how this is evolving and changing. The second kind of area of focus is around your products and services. And that's critically important to know that in doing the business, the company business, that you are conscious of the human rights elements that feed within it. And I think the case studies today will speak to that. And particularly if you think about the changing and evolving nature, kind of digital and privacy is something that has come up recently more and more. 20, maybe 30 years ago, it wouldn't be an issue. And so it's important for companies to think about their actual products and services and how this can either have a positive impact or have a negative impact. And ideally, you want companies to be thinking about how they can use their products and services to have a positive impact and not just looking at how they can prevent negative impact. The third and the quite complex one is around supply chain. And obviously there is huge potential here, firstly for significant human rights issues to emerge, but also, again, to take a more proactive and positive approach around how companies can work with their suppliers and within their supply chain to ensure that there is a firm grounding and understanding of human rights within that. I think we're all aware of some of the big cases that have happened globally over the years. Nike is one that pops to mind, where there were instances within the supply chain that that really fell on the company. And I think that's becoming more and more of a focus from civil rights organizations, investors, in ensuring that companies have that grounding within the supply chain. And then there's community, and this can be the communities in which companies operate, but also speaks to customers. And I think, again, talking about this changing nature and why it is so important for companies to be on top of this and have a firm understanding of it is because the ways of identifying and calling out companies has changed a lot. Twitter, as we all know, is a space that very easily can be used to hold companies to account. And that is a space that requires quick response. And if that work hasn't happened internally, it's very difficult to give a response that will be appropriate and acceptable. And so it's kind of speaking to this changing nature of business and why more and more it is important that the deep work has happened within organizations and that there's a solid approach to these issues. I would say that in that deep thinking and the deep work, what's very important for companies to reflect on and to take on board is to avoid talking amongst ourselves. And so to ensure that there are outside voices that are brought in to the discussion, because those perspectives are critical in how a company understands how human rights may play out across the value chain and within their organization. It's very often that there might be blind spots. And if you were to engage with civil society, for an example, you would find that there are areas that companies don't often think about that would be critical. And so in that process, an openness and a vulnerability to having external input can strengthen quite significantly the way that companies think about these issues. I'm almost done, Kathy, 1 minute and I'll be done. The last thing, or the second last thing I wanted to talk about was the issue of remedy. And I think that an area that does need to be strengthened within the South African context in particular is how we provide mechanisms for human rights issues to be raised and to be reported, and also how we protect those that do that. And I think if we look at the anti-corruption, the corruption space, we've seen horrendous things happen to whistleblowers in that. And that is something that I think requires a collective approach, because ultimately the people who do that are working to improve and to really call to account those that need to be called to account. And so I do think that from a business perspective, this is an area that I think does require some thinking and some work. And lastly, I want to say that Kathy mentioned that the NBI, along with the UNGC, had published a toolkit. It was, I think, just over 5 years ago that it was published. And so mostly very relevant, remains very relevant, and details in quite a significant amount of detail all of the legislation, the regulations, conventions, and codes that speak to human rights along the aspects of environment, social, labor, community, and really provides a framework for understanding what's applicable and relevant to companies, but also how to navigate this space. So I'll stop there, Kathy, and I hope that that provides a picture of how business can think about addressing human rights.
Thanks, Gugu. We could have gone on listening to you the whole time. That was a wonderful overview. Thank you. I think very useful to start with those UN guiding principles, which are kind of the overarching principles globally, but then to move on to some more practical information around sphere of influence and how companies can start looking at human rights. Okay, we're going to move on to our 2 case studies now to hear how 2 companies in very different sectors have actually gone on this journey and implemented this. And to start with, we've got Lindo Kuzwayo, who's the Strategic Engagement Principal at Anglo Platinum. So firstly, we're hearing from Anglo Plat, mining, extractive industry, and then we're going to move on to telco. Thank you, Linda. If you could just tell us a little bit about Anglo Platinum's journey, some of the challenges you've had and some of the learnings from implementing human rights.
Thank you so much, Kathy. A pleasure and an honor really to be part of today's conversation, something I'm really passionate about. Also having moved from Anglo-American's group legal into the function that I'm in now. So I really am interested and passionate in it. I have to just say that, you know, the Anglo-American Platinum human rights journey is one that we can confidently say has always had a significant presence, especially under the umbrella of the incredible work that's been done at group level across the business units like Platinum, of course, and then Kumba and De Beers. However, it's also important to actually acknowledge that this journey was cemented in the past couple of years with a dedicated resource like myself and others within the Platinum business unit itself to enhance the business unit specific business and human rights strategy, to improve the way in which we engage with civil society and other stakeholders, and then also to streamline the human rights imperatives that find expression in the various policies within Anglo. So I'll expound on some of these policies just for purposes of some information. It is important to note, of course, that these, along with other global blueprints, these policies reflect the UNDP 6 best practices on embedding human rights that you mentioned. So the first is a code of conduct, which is stock standard, I suppose, in a lot of organizations and entities. So it's not only, the Anglo-American one not only explains the boundaries within which we must work every day and really bring together in one place our material, ethical principles and policies. But what it does is that it really expresses and sets out our fundamental commitment to respecting human rights as a starting point. Then we have our human rights policy, which codifies our intention to align with the UNGP's voluntary principles on security and human rights, and to support the corporate responsibility to respect human rights by actively seeking to avoid involvement with human rights abuses. What it does is that it actually shows how we aim to identify, assess, and minimize potential adverse human rights impacts that not only we may cause, but that we may contribute to, or those that are linked to our business as well. The third policy, if you like, for lack of a better word, is the Anglo-American social way, which some of the attendees may have heard of. So this is the tool through which we have been able to ensure that policies and systems are in place in all of Anglo-American managed sites to support effective engagement within our affected communities, to avoid or minimize adverse social impacts and maximize our development opportunities. So in terms of the specific human rights requirements in the social way itself, I'll just list 6 of them. The first is training on human rights for employees, contractors, and business partners. The second is an integration into the risk and impact assessment processes, and I'll speak about that shortly. The third is integration of assessment results into our social management plans, our operating model, and our life of mine plan. So very technical in that. The fourth is the implementation of site-level grievance mechanisms that are aligned with the social work itself. The fifth is continuous monitoring, evaluation, and reporting on human rights. And the sixth is the involvement of potentially affected stakeholders, including vulnerable groups, in the assessment, design, and monitoring of mitigation measures. So really a highlighting of stakeholder engagement there. Then within the social way itself, we have a tool within a tool, if you like, which is namely the social and human rights impact and rights analysis, what we call the SHIRA. Some critical points to note about the SHIRA is that it provides a comprehensive cross-functional assessment of social and human rights impacts annually, including a prioritization rating that reflects the UNGP process itself. So there's a large focus on impacts as opposed to only business risks, which we've even changed. It really wasn't that way in the past. And this is a huge shift in the commercial context. The SHIRA is based on an extensive vulnerability assessment on systemic and site-related vulnerability. External reporting is an imperative, and this is actually done through collaboration and really a co-creative process. So we look at using community engagement forums where they exist or equivalent platforms. And So therefore, again, informed by large stakeholder engagement components. And lastly, the SHIRA uses a mitigation hierarchy in that regard. The fourth policy I'll describe as our responsible sourcing standards. So this is our, the full name is our responsible sourcing standard for suppliers, and it's been updated in 2020 to ensure, of course, that we mitigate against COVID-19 risks by ensuring that all suppliers throughout our value chains commit to do various things, such as, amongst others, protecting the health and safety of their workforce, not using child labor, combating all forms of modern slavery, ensuring that these entities maintain working hours which meet legal requirements, promoting an inclusive workplace, and lastly, not permitting unauthorized or illegal salary reductions. So from an assurance perspective, in terms of responsible sourcing, we are rolling out the standard of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, across our sites. Our own key PGM mine in Zimbabwe was the first in the world to publicly commit to be independently audited against the IRMA standard for responsible mining in 2019. And it's both the first mine in Africa and actually the first producing platinum group metals operation to complete the audit. And we're rolling that out across our sites locally as well. The fifth policy or plan is our Sustainable Mining Plan, or the SMP as we call it, and it comprises of mutually reinforcing elements that will positively transform how our stakeholders experience our business, both locally and globally, and ultimately leave a much reduced physical footprint. The SMP is built around three major areas of global sustainability pillars aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we're mostly all familiar with. And we have a set of global stretch goals relating to each of them. And these are healthy environment, secondly, thriving communities, and of course, trusted corporate leader. So while we're trying to raise the bar when it comes to sustainability, we know that we need to make sure we operate in all aspects of our business responsibly. And that's why the Sustainable Mining Plan is underpinned by our critical foundations. And these are in 6 parts. The first is leadership and culture, zero harm, human rights, as a standalone critical foundation, then inclusion and diversity. Fifth is our group standards and processes, and sixth is compliance with legal requirements. So in practical terms, what does some of this mean? And I will be done shortly. So Anglo American has protected the lives, or has really tried to protect the lives and livelihoods of our employees and communities through our We Care pandemic response program. We are also in the process of streamlining our thorough human rights due diligence and VKSHR assessments at our sites. So wider HRDD processes have been run at group level previously, and now we're filtering that to a site level assessment. We've also recognized the gender-based violence as a human rights violation, and our Living with Dignity program in collaboration with NGOs and community organizations has really helped us to increase efforts in addressing GBV groups. And much like most industries, of course, there's been significant developments in our investor and PGM customer expectations around the implementation of key business and human rights standards. Investors are actually asking more and more questions about the environments in which we navigate, in the context in which we navigate, and how we intend to actually alleviate impact, particularly human rights, and really it's rightfully so that they ask these questions. We also continue, as challenging as it is, to make considerable efforts to understand human rights through the lens of civil society, not just our own perspective, but also applying an NGO engagement strategy in accordance with this, that really provides this guiding framework that keeps us accountable to other stakeholders and not just to our commercial partners. So we have, in conclusion, I really would like to say that we have extensive training, we have systems and processes in place. Some are long-standing and others that have been added in the last few years to really close some of the gaps we've seen we've had. And we really tried to keep improving both the physical and psychological safety that every employee should have, so that they can feel that they can bring their best selves to work. This is then combined with a well-established and confidential channel and various channels, employees, and then our other stakeholders like our suppliers and community members, to report any inappropriate behavior like human rights violations, And this is done with proper investigation and actions are taken in response. So Anglo-American has long understood the role of its business in society, and we believe our responsibility to society extends beyond our own mind gaze. All in all, taking a step back to understand what a meaningful existence is through the eyes of our stakeholders and addressing systemic issues that cause a symptom of human rights violation really helps us to keep ourselves alert and accountable in alignment with all the sometimes very theoretical and wonderful policies and strategies that are found. We try to steer away from a compliance-based approach and steer closer to a value-based approach, largely supported by the Anglo-American values of safety, innovation, accountability, care and respect, integrity, and collaboration. And I promise I'll.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, very quick overview of what sounds like extremely comprehensive policies, procedures, and standards. And like Gugu, you've emphasized the stakeholder engagement being part of all of that, and having grievance mechanisms and remedies. So thank you. I'm interested to maybe move on to some of the challenges in implementing all of those codes and standards when we get onto the Q&A. And just speaking of Q&A, please can I remind delegates, and I know we do have a number of stakeholders in the audience, so there were a number of nonprofits as well as companies. Please do put your questions into the Q&A box, because after our third panelist, I'll be taking questions from there. So I'm now going to hand over to Marina Madala, who is the General Manager of Sustainability and Shared Value at MTN. Linda's just mentioned how reporting is so vital, and I know one of the things you've done at MTN is the first ever Pan-African transparency report for MTN. So I'm going to hand over to you to talk to us about digital rights and your journey as MTN on human rights and this transparency journey.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's so good to be with you today and to share some of our journey and our lessons. Obviously, for those who are not familiar with MTN, we're an emerging market mobile operator, probably Africa's largest. We operate in 19 markets, both in Africa and the Middle East. Looking at the nature of the type of markets we operate in, most often than not, MTN is either the first or the second largest operator in the country. And so the economies are heavily dependent on MTN to provide connectivity. And so when it comes to human rights, a lot of those countries are quite unique, quite interesting, quite dynamic. And I'll talk you through a little bit around our approach, which is ever evolving given the market realities. When you look at the telecommunications sector specifically, there are many shifts from a human rights perspective, from conflict minerals, child online protection, labor-related matters, and so forth. What we constantly have to do is keep up with the technological breakthroughs and dynamics, and then also the geopolitical factors that influence our markets. I think one of the largest, in which we have seen both in the Arab Spring and also across the continent, is that with a more youthful population of about 50 to 60% of majority of the markets across this continent, the youth are the generation that most either governments, corporates, and everyone is striving to ensure that we address their needs, but also specifically they are the most vocal where rights are concerned, whether online or otherwise. For the purpose of the discussion today, MTN does look at broader human rights, but I'll specifically focus on digital human rights, which includes aspects such as freedom of expression, data privacy and security, as well as information security as well. When you look at broader, you can imagine that majority of the markets in which we operate each have their own legislation. There's also license conditions. So what we do is we look at international standards, some of which that Gugu has mentioned today, and Kathy and so forth, We really use those international standards as the North Star for us in majority of our policies, processes, and our approach. And some of them, I think, have been mentioned already in terms of the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights. There's also the OECD that we specifically also look at. And then I think most recently, we're quite encouraged by seeing the greater emphasis that the GRI has placed on business and human rights. When we start now looking at MTN's strategic approach, we have a detailed and quite robust digital and overall human rights strategy, which specifically looks at the rights of different users, their different types of rights. We also then look at incident management and how we manage that. We also then, the second aspect is we look at the impact that we have. And as Gugu's touched on, looking at, how do we address these impacts? How do we track the effectiveness of some of the measures we have to be able to address these rights and so forth. And then we also look at responsible advocacy. And that's why sessions like this are very important to us, because we believe it really is around understanding the diverse views of different stakeholders. And then specifically looking at aspects like, educating different stakeholders on some of the components, the nuances of the sector and so forth. And then last but not least, as Kathy already touched on, is disclosure. That's really important to us. We want to be as open and honest as we can be. And that's why we really undertook our journey to have our transparency report. We're actually working on the next edition at this particular moment. So overarching, MTN has a digital human rights policy based on a lot of the frameworks that we've spoken about. And the policy is supported by a digital human rights due diligence framework, which is aligned to the RUGI respect, protect, and remedy principles. We look specifically at aspects in sort of three phases. One, pre any incident occurring, assessing, understanding risks, understanding what's about to happen, where the country is about to enter election period, what are the likely scenarios that would play out, and so forth. And then during the incident, from the time we receive a request through to determining how to understand the request, engaging different stakeholders, and then ultimately how we respond. And then the last component is what do we do post an incident? What kind of remedies do we undertake? And how do we specifically ensure that we incorporate the lessons learned? Because continuous improvement is something that's really, really important to us, especially with an ever-changing and evolving market dynamics. I think as we update a lot of these frameworks, and one of the lessons learned, encourage other corporates and other types of organizations is really to keep looking at human rights from a rights holder perspective, understanding the different rights and understanding the implication of different decisions on those rights. For us, in terms of some of the practical lessons learned and applications, what we find is that no one instance is the same. The dynamics shift from Eswatini to Sudan, to South Sudan, Nigeria, and so forth. Every single situation, there's components that are similar, whether it's a request for customer data, or an internet shutdown, or a service shutdown, or a service interruption. Whatever the format may be, the nuances and the dynamics extremely different. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Whilst the policy and the due diligence framework act to try and standardize and set out the minimum standards, we recognize that it's important to be adaptable and to be able to look at each situation as it comes. And that's why we've done a lot of work around understanding the different scenarios and the different options available to us in every single instance. And it's really around weighing some of the consequences of each of these options, whether it's loss of life, severity of risks, security risks to staff, officers, infrastructure, whether it would open us up to litigation, whether it result in deportation, imprisonment, or loss of operating license. So we take all these factors into consideration as we make every single decision. And at the end of the day, it's really around taking these policies and processes and ensuring that it informs decision making at the end of the day. And so we engage a lot and consult a lot, both with other operators, with civil society organizations, legal institutions, and government and other stakeholders in every single instance to make sure that we are making the most informed decision with all available information at the time. At MTN, human rights is taken so seriously that we involve every single level of management, from the board to the CEO, in the markets, the regional vice presidents, and so forth. So for us, consultation, engagement, and management participation is instrumental, and it happens as we go along. I think one of the things that Kathy mentioned from the article that was really important is the fact around how a lot of stakeholders perceive a disconnect between commitment and action. And that's one thing that as MTN we strive to do, is to move our policies and processes from simply being documents that are there to documents that are used and that guide decision making. As an example, in South Sudan, we received a directive for customer data, and we actually pushed back. And I want to quote one of the civil society organizations' response to that and to how MTN handled the matter. And from the People's Coalition of Civil Action, they commented and said, "We commend the professionalism of MTN management in South Sudan, refusing to compromise on privacy and safety of subscribers." And so whilst there may be many stories that people pick up in the media, there are also many stories of where we've pushed back and where we've stood for the rights of people. And for us, when there's consistent application, congruency between what we say and what we do, that for us becomes the definition of victory, of putting the rights of people above all. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Marina. Really fascinating. As I think it was Gugu who mentioned, I mean, relatively new sets of human rights, these digital data privacy information, and fascinating case study that you gave there, and MTN having to make decisions around operating licenses versus security and elections. So yeah, thanks for that case study. Okay, if I can just ask delegates, if you do have a question, pop it into the Q&A box. We've got around 10 minutes left. So I am going to just ask the panelists, please, to turn on your videos and cameras. And we're going to go around. I'm going to start with Lindo, actually. You spoke about your very comprehensive codes, standards, policies. And I wonder if you could just tell us, and maybe use an incident or an example, as Marina did with the South Sudan example, but just what is one of the big challenges been in implementing these, and how have you addressed that?
Where do I start? It's the extractive industry is not one that is easy to navigate around. And then you add to that, of course, the layer of it being in the South African context and the historical, burdens essentially that we're carrying in the industry as well. So I would say that, from an internal, I'll start with an internal and maybe external ensuring that this notion of psychological safety and the like, and that people really feel from an employment context that they have the platform to raise awareness on human rights and the like. And even though we have these wonderful policies, practically what that means is that there's been a lot of change management that's necessary to sort of foster that. And then in making sure that the internal policies that we have really, you know, externally a good application, is that, you know, we're dealing obviously in a country like South Africa, as I say, with a scenario where we have to transcend the boxes and constraints that we previously had, especially, for instance, with the fact that it's only a particular employee or certain types of individuals, maybe even externally, who need to concern themselves about human rights impact. So we'll find in a context that we have mining processes that tick the box in all the technical aspects, but having to really push to implement this human rights element and really filter it into some of the systems that are highlighted has really been a challenge. And then also the change management that I must say, and giving the process time, while we have moved across from being more defensive as an organization and really seeking to engage more meaningfully with stakeholders like civil society and our community, it can't be an overnight process, because there's this huge trust deficit that we acknowledge and know that we're working with. So it's really giving patience to the process that really has been a really big challenge, and really we're seeking different ways of trying to highlight that in order to.
Thanks, Lindo. There's actually a question that's coming from Louise, and so I'm going to stick with you just for a minute. I think you've touched on it now, speaking about the change management, but Louise asks, how would you say the uptake of the human rights systems has been at Anglo Platinum? Often there's pushback, as many see this as a soft issue. And, you know, you've spoken about the fact that it takes time and it's change management, but what would you say the buy-in is, you know, both from staff, management, you know, where you're at?
Buy-in it's increasing. I think, like it or not, you admit that having the push from external stakeholders like customers and investors and shareholders, for anyone who's a little bit more stubborn in realizing that it's not just a soft issue, for people who are more, you know, financially astute and where the bottom line matters, for them to see that sort of fallout in the global economy, and the importance and rise of ESG issues, that really helps to get people on board. But internally, again, really robust measures to try and be unapologetic about filtering everything relating to human rights in some of the existing systems, and building systems where necessary to do so has been very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, and you did speak right at the beginning of how you have built the human rights into the risk processes, you know, the existing risk processes of the business.
Exactly, and also into the different business units that we have. So it's not just the group function anymore, but really making sure that the commodities we represent have adequate uses.
Thanks, Linda. Gugu, I'm going to move over to you. You touched on the issue of remedy. And so I suppose two parts. One is about, you know, what should companies be thinking about in terms of remedy? And secondly, how do you think companies should be dealt with that are non-compliant or that have repeat incidents, human rights incidents?
Not an easy one, Kathy. Thank you, though. So, I mean, I think that the case studies are actually very useful, you know, in giving the context to how you would think about it from all angles. And from a risk perspective, when you think about risk, it's not just what could the risk be, but if it did happen, how would we deal with it? And I think that firstly, I think what companies need to do is to be responsive, and for certain issues, there is an urgency around how you deal with it. And so where these issues are dealt with becomes important. Does it sit at a board level? Is it at an exco level? Where does it sit within the business to allow for these things to happen quickly? And possibly what's changed over a while is kind of where these issues sit. And to the question that was asked around, these soft issues and what's the buy-in? I think that there is a stronger recognition of the importance of it. And so it's being dealt with where it needs to be, where decisions can be made quickly. I also think that it's important that and again, the examples talked about stakeholder engagement and getting external views on it. When you have good relationships or constructive relationships with civil society, with community groups, with academia, you're able to leverage that to think about what would be the most appropriate way to remedy this situation if there isn't a clear answer to it. And I do think that because of this, I suppose, very public, social media driven pressure on companies, that the need to do this quickly and urgently is quite strong and becoming increasingly so. You can't take a month to respond to something. It has to be something that's dealt with quickly. And so I do think that there is, and I think it was Marina who spoke about where these issues sit and are dealt with and how you respond to it. I mean, I think in terms of repeat offenders, I mean, there have been instances most recently of how civil society groups have grouped together to, take companies to court and take a legal approach to it. I think that you want to avoid that as a company. You don't want it to get to that place. And so again, it speaks to that process of, okay, how do we co-think about this issue and not kind of fall into the way of working where business uses its power to, push things through. So I do think that there's an aspect around strengthening the legislation, the regulatory aspect of it. But I do think civil society does play quite a critical role in holding companies to account.
Thank you, Gugu. And Marina, I'm going to move to you now. And you've actually touched on what Gugu was saying there when you spoke about MTN involving every level of management in these decisions in order to be able to respond quickly and kind of on the ground in the different circumstance. But I'm going to ask you to end off for us on, and I've just seen questions coming in, but it's 2 minutes to go. I wish they had come earlier. To just finish off by telling us what advice you would give to organizations that can be nonprofits and companies who are looking to improve their human rights practices.
The advice I would give, which I've touched on, is to be adaptable. I think it's very easy to remain sort of rigid and say, okay, the law, the standard, the right says XYZ, therefore you have to stick to it. I think it really is around moving from theoretical to application. So, and that's one of the areas we focused a lot on MTN. We literally had to relook our entire toolkit to say, are we giving people something so rigid based on the legislation, or are we giving something that is practical, that is, reduced steps, but still thorough and so forth. So I would say revisit your systems and processes, keep making sure they are aligned to best practice. At the same time, make it as practical as possible. Like Lindo touched on, it's a change journey. If you overwhelm people with a lot at the same time and you're saying, okay, follow these 10 steps, the likelihood of them following exactly the 10 steps is quite low. You'll probably find they'll follow maybe 5 out of them. So just make it simple, make it practical, and make it with the end user in mind so that they can grasp it. Buy-in is the most important thing. If you have people adopting and saying, I have a role to play in human rights, I can protect people's rights by doing 1, 2, and 3. If you make it practical, they buy into it. Bob's your uncle. You're able to implement and really be successful at what you do.
Thank you, Marina. I think that was a wonderful note to end on. We are out of time. I'd just like to give all our three panelists a big thank you and a virtual round of applause. That really has been super interesting and useful. And to all the delegates, thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, we will be sharing a write-up of this and the recording. And what we will do is also share some of the resources that have been mentioned by the panelists in that write-up, so that you can have links to further resources and information. But thanks again to our panelists. And yes, I hope to see everyone at our webinar next month and at our conference in May. Thanks.